Okay, here's part 3 of the lecture series on sensation and perception. We got to this in some of my classes, in a few I don't think we did, so this might again be a little bit of review for some of you. Laws of perceptual organization. There are 5 laws of perceptual organization that I want to talk to you guys about today. The first one is proximity. If something is proximal, that means that it is close to you. Okay, so by definition, proximity simply means that objects or things that are close together in physical space tend to be viewed as one object or one thing. Again, proximity, objects that are close together in physical space tend to be viewed or perceived as one thing. So for example, if you very quickly look at this image and I would ask you sitting there, what do you see? Most of you are probably going to say, I see a class. It's a classroom. You're not probably going to look at this and say, well, here's a notebook, here's a creepy looking teacher, there's a light fixture, there's a beam in the wall, oh, there's a guy with a yellow shirt on. You're not going to pick it apart like that because the objects are so close together in physical space that you're just going to look at this and say, it's a classroom. Okay. The next law of perceptual organization is similarity. As you might imagine, similar means alike. So objects, by definition, objects that are alike tend to be viewed or perceived as one thing or one unit. Okay? Objects that are similar or alike tend to be viewed or perceived as one thing or one unit. I'll give you another example of that. If I ask you to look up at this image and I ask you to tell me what you see, most of you are probably going to say, well, it's a ceiling. You're not going to look at this and say, well, here's a tile, well, there's a light fixture, and it looks like a vent. And I don't know if you can make it out, but there's a sprinkler right there. You're not going to pick it apart like that. The objects are similar enough that you're going to realize that this is just one thing or perceive it as one thing. The next one is pregnant. This is a German word that literally translates to simplest explanation. We have a tendency to perceive things in the simplest way, especially when it comes to vision. And what I'm going to do is try to demonstrate this for you here with a crude drawing. So again, we try to find the simplest explanation for things. And if I ask you, as I'm drawing this, to tell me what you see here, generally I get 3 responses. Now I want you to think, before I say anything, what you see here. There are 3 very popular answers. A lot of times people will say, I see a square or a diamond or something like that between 2 lines. That's a very common way to perceive that. If you look at it a little more closely, you might say, well, I see a forwards K and a backwards K. See that? There's the forwards K and the backwards K. The third most common way to perceive that is the letter W on top of the letter M. You can see that. W on top of the M. Okay? Pretty basic ways to perceive that. We kind of look for the easiest and the simplest way to do that. Sometimes people have very complicated ways of perceiving. It's possible that I could look at this and say, well, this is the top of a mountain right here, and here's the pit down here at the bottom where all the bodies are going to be buried, and this is like part of the knife blade right here. See that? There's another knife blade. Now, if I start explaining this to you in these words and these terms, you're probably going to think there's a little something wrong with me. But sometimes people do perceive things in a very complicated and strange way. But generally, we look for the simplest explanation. Now, the next law of perceptual organization is closure. Simply, this means that we have a tendency to fill in the gaps perceptually. We have a tendency to fill in the gaps. We'll start with visual perception. If I hold this up, hope you guys can see this okay, and I ask you to tell me what that is. A lot of you are going to say, well, it's a circle or a sphere. It's really not. It's a bunch of dashes. They're not connected. But our eyes have a tendency to kind of close in those gaps. We have a tendency to kind of bridge that gap or bridge those gaps. We also do this in our relationships with people. If you've ever been in a relationship, this is the example I used in several of my classes. If you've ever been on the losing end of a breakup in a relationship, the moment that you find out someone is breaking up with you, you're probably going to want some closure. You're going to want to have some questions answered. Like, why? What is it? What's wrong with me? Is it somebody else? At least you're going to want to know. God forbid you lose a loved one. There's a process of closure. There's a funeral. There's usually a religious or a church service. There's a burial. There's a grieving process to get closure on that relationship. And last but not least, we have the law of common fate. The law of common fate simply says that objects that move in the same direction and at the same speed tend to be viewed as one object. Okay? Again, objects that move in the same direction and at the same speed tend to be perceived as one object. If you've ever looked up and you see a flock of birds flying in one direction, you're probably not going to look up and say, well, I see one bird, here's another bird, there's another bird, there's another bird. No, you're going to perceive that as one object. Same with airplanes flying in formation. You're probably going to view this as one object or one thing because, again, they're moving in the same direction and at the same speed. Now, sometimes we get it wrong when we talk about incorrect perceptions at this point. Now, I think we've talked about this in some of my classes already. Now, write this down. Hallucinations and delusions, the top two, are internally generated incorrect perceptions. Internally generated incorrect perceptions. Internally means that only the person experiencing the hallucination or the delusion is getting to experience that. Nobody else is experiencing it the same way. Hallucinations are based on sensory information. Sometimes people will have visual hallucinations where they see things that are not real, or they'll suffer from auditory hallucinations where they hear voices or sounds that are not real. I've given you some examples in class of some of those. A delusion is also an internally generated incorrect perception based on a fixed and false belief. I'm not talking just like you believe that somebody likes you when they really don't. That's not really a delusion. If I believe with all of my heart that I am Johnny Manziel, quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, or if I believe with all of my heart that I am President Obama, now we're talking about something that's delusional. Okay, it's really outside of the realm of what you would really expect. Now, illusions and mirages are a little bit different. Those are externally generated incorrect perceptions. External, that means that everybody experiences them the same way. An illusion deals with manipulation of the physical environment. Like a magician would do a magic trick. And he might have a coin in his hand. If I can find one. Like a sleight of hand kind of trick. Here's a quarter. So the magician would say, okay, I'm putting the quarter in this hand. It's gone. Uh-oh, where did it go? Oh, there it is. Well, how did it get in that hand? Well, you all experience that the same way. It's a trick. You know that really what I'm doing is I'm not putting it in this hand. I'm keeping it in this hand. So it's just kind of a silly trick. Okay. If you've seen a magician saw a woman in half, and you see her hands moving on one side of the stage and her legs moving on the other side, you're seeing it the same way, but you know it's not real. And a mirage is also an incorrect perception that is externally generated, but it deals with atmospheric conditions. The classic example is the guy who is crawling through the hot desert sand and he sees the water. The closer he gets to the water, the further away it gets, and he never really gets to it. If you've been driving your car on a hot day in the summertime, you would see what appears to be water standing in the road. Well, it's really just the heat interacting with the asphalt, and you don't really ever get to that water. It's a mirage, so you experience it the same way. So those are just some things that we'll kind of, especially the hallucinations and the delusions, we'll come back to those and talk about those more specifically when we talk about some of the mental health disorders. And that's it for that part. Thanks, guys.